James Morton's courtroom ran like clockwork. For 20 years, he had served as a judge in London's busy courthouse, becoming known for his strict adherence to rules. Today was no different as he adjusted his glasses and called for the next case. The bailiff announced, "Case number 247, speeding in a school zone." Judge Morton looked up from his papers to see a well-dressed black woman approaching the stand. Something about her caught his attention immediately. Unlike most people who appeared before him, she carried herself with unusual dignity and calm. "Your name, please," he said in his practiced formal tone. "Victoria Bennett," she replied clearly. The judge examined the case file. "Ms. Bennett, you were recorded driving 38 miles per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour school zone. How do you plead?" "Your Honor, I admit I was speeding, but there were special circumstances I'd like to explain," she said. Judge Morton tried not to sigh visibly. Every day, people stood before him with excuses. His job was to apply the law, not listen to stories. But something in her composed manner made him nod. "Go ahead, but please be brief. The court has many cases today. I received an urgent call that my mother had suffered a stroke. The hospital told me her condition was worsening rapidly, and I was trying to get there as quickly as possible." The judge's expression remained unchanged. He had heard similar emergencies claimed before. "Do you have any documentation of this hospital emergency? A doctor's note, perhaps?" Victoria searched through her handbag but came up empty-handed. "I'm afraid I don't, Your Honor. Everything happened so quickly, and I've been at the hospital most days since then." Judge Morton nodded, his decision already made. Rules were rules, after all. "Without supporting evidence, I must find you guilty as charged. The fine is £350, due immediately. The clerk will take your payment." "I understand," Victoria said, showing no anger or frustration. "Thank you for hearing me out." As she turned to leave, Judge Morton was already looking down at the next case file. Victoria Bennett was just another name, another case number in his busy day. He thought nothing more of her as she paid her fine and left his courtroom. That evening, Judge Morton drove home to his quiet house in the suburbs. His wife had passed away 5 years ago, and his children lived in different cities with families of their own. The large house felt empty as he warmed up a pre-made dinner and sat alone at the kitchen table. The television played quietly in the background as he ate. He thought about the day's cases, barely remembering the woman who had been speeding to reach her ill mother. James Morton had seen thousands of faces come through his courtroom over the years. They all blended together after a while. Before bed, he reviewed some legal papers for the next day's cases. He was known as a fair judge, if somewhat strict. James took pride in applying the law consistently and without favoritism. That was justice, he believed. Little did he know that his encounter with Victoria Bennett would soon come back into his life in a way he could never have imagined. The brief 5-minute appearance in his courtroom would turn out to be anything but routine. As he turned off his bedside lamp that night, James Morton had no idea that in just 3 weeks' time, that same woman would be thrust into the national spotlight. He didn't know that their paths would cross again, and that this meeting would force him to question everything about how he administered justice. For now, she was just another case closed, another fine collected. The speeding ticket was filed away, both literally in the court records and figuratively in his mind. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new people, and new legal questions to resolve. In her own home that night, Victoria Bennett sat beside her mother's hospital bed, having arranged for temporary home care. As her mother slept, Victoria reviewed important legal briefs. Despite her busy schedule and her mother's health crisis, she had accepted the speeding ticket with grace, choosing not to mention her prestigious legal career or the important meeting she had missed that day. Their lives would soon intersect again in ways neither could anticipate, setting in motion events that would change them both forever. 3 weeks passed quickly for Judge Morton. Each day blended into the next with the same routine. He woke at 6, read the morning paper with his tea, and arrived at the courthouse by 8:30. Cases came and went. He listened, judged, and moved on. On this particular morning, James was running late. He had slept poorly, his mind troubled by a dream he couldn't quite remember. He rushed through his morning routine, grabbing his tea in a travel mug and foregoing the newspaper. Only when he settled into his car did he turn on the radio to catch the news. The announcer's voice filled the small space. Breaking news this morning as Prime Minister Williams has nominated respected civil rights lawyer Victoria Bennett to become the newest Justice of the Supreme Court. Bennett, who graduated at the top of her class from Oxford Law, has won several landmark cases throughout her distinguished career. James nearly swerved off the road. Victoria Bennett? The name rang a bell immediately. He turned up the volume. Bennett has been praised for her calm temperament and deep understanding of the law. The Prime Minister called her one of the finest legal minds of her generation during this morning's announcement. James pulled into the courthouse parking lot just as the radio began playing a clip from the press conference. "I am deeply honored by this nomination," said a familiar voice. "I believe that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but a deep respect for the dignity of every person who comes before the court." He sat frozen in his parking space. It couldn't be the same woman who had appeared in his courtroom for a speeding ticket. But something told him it was. When James finally reached his office, he immediately opened his computer and searched for news about the nomination. There she was on the screen, the same composed woman who had stood before him 3 weeks ago, the same woman he had fined without a second thought. The article detailed her impressive career. Victoria Bennett had argued important cases before the highest courts. She had worked to protect the rights of vulnerable people. She was respected across the political spectrum for her fairness and intelligence. And he had treated her like just another person with an excuse. James felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. Why hadn't she mentioned who she was? Why hadn't she tried to use her position to escape the fine? His assistant knocked on the door. "Judge, your first case is ready." "Give me a moment," he replied, still staring at Victoria Bennett's picture on the screen. Throughout the day, James found it hard to concentrate. Between cases, he kept thinking about how Victoria had explained about her mother's stroke. He had dismissed her explanation so quickly. He wondered if her mother had recovered. During lunch, alone in his chambers, he watched more coverage of the nomination. Several colleagues of Victoria spoke about her character. "Vicky never uses her position for special treatment," said one fellow lawyer. "She believes the law applies equally to everyone." Another clip showed Victoria visiting a community legal center, where she volunteered monthly. "Everyone deserves to be heard," she said to the interviewer. "Justice isn't just for those who can afford expensive lawyers." James pushed away his half-eaten sandwich. Something uncomfortable was growing in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Was it shame? That evening, instead of going straight home, James drove to a small park near his house. He sat on a bench, watching parents play with their children. When had he stopped seeing the people in his courtroom as real people with lives and challenges? When had efficiency become more important than compassion? James thought about writing a note of congratulation to Victoria Bennett. But what would he say? "Sorry I didn't listen about your mother's stroke. Congratulations on your nomination?" As the sun began to set, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would start listening differently. He would remember that each person in his courtroom was a human being first, a case number second. What he didn't know was that his path would cross with Victoria Bennett's again. And when it did, she would surprise him even more. As he walked back to his car, James felt both troubled and oddly hopeful. Perhaps it wasn't too late to become the kind of judge he had once dreamed of being, one who balanced the scales of justice with the weight of human compassion. The Supreme Court confirmation hearings began on a Tuesday morning. James Morton had arranged to have the afternoon off so he could watch them on television. He settled into his living room chair, remote in hand, and turned on the TV just as Victoria Bennett was being sworn in before the committee. She wore a simple navy blue suit and carried herself with the same quiet dignity he remembered from his courtroom. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore minimal jewelry, just small pearl earrings and a thin gold watch. Nothing flashy, nothing that called attention to herself. "Ms. Bennett, could you tell us about your background and what has prepared you for this important role?" asked the committee chairperson. Victoria nodded and leaned toward the microphone. I grew up in a small town outside Manchester. My father was a schoolteacher, and my mother worked as a nurse. They taught me the value of education, hard work, and treating everyone with respect. James listened carefully as she described her journey through law school, her early career as a public defender, and her later work on civil rights cases. She spoke clearly and thoughtfully, never rushing her words. When asked about her judicial philosophy, Victoria said something that made James sit up straighter. My mother taught me that true character is revealed in how we treat others when we think no one important is watching, she said. And in how we respond when we are the ones being judged. I believe justice is about seeing the full humanity in every person who comes before the court. James felt as if she were speaking directly to him. Had she remembered their brief encounter in his courtroom? Was this a message for him? As the hearing continued, one senator asked about a time when Victoria had faced unfair treatment. She paused before answering. Recently, my mother suffered a serious stroke. While rushing to the hospital, I was stopped for speeding in a school zone. James's heart began to pound. She was going to mention him by name, tell everyone how coldly he had treated her. I appeared before a judge who fined me according to the law, she continued. I had no documentation of the emergency, and the judge applied the law as written. Some might see this as unfair treatment, but I don't. Rules exist for a reason, even in emergencies. James stared at the screen in disbelief. She wasn't criticizing him at all. However, Victoria added, that experience reminded me how important it is for those of us in the legal system to listen with care to every person who comes before us. Justice isn't just about applying rules, it's about understanding the human context in which those rules operate. The hearings continued for hours. Victoria answered difficult questions with honesty and intelligence. She never seemed rattled or defensive, even when some committee members asked tough questions about her past cases. That evening, James sat at his desk with a blank notecard before him. 3 times he started to write a note of congratulation to Victoria, and 3 times he crumpled the card and threw it away. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound self-serving or hollow? The next morning, James arrived at court earlier than usual. His first case involved a young man who had missed community service hours because his bus had broken down. In the past, James might have dismissed the excuse and applied the full penalty. Today, he asked questions. He learned the young man worked 2 jobs to support his younger siblings. He learned about the unreliable bus route the young man depended on. And then James did something unusual. He worked with the court clerk to reschedule the community service hours for days when the young man wasn't working. Thank you for listening, Your Honor, the young man said as he left. Throughout the day, James found himself paying closer attention to the people before him. He still applied the law, but he took more time to understand the circumstances. It felt good, like returning to the kind of judge he had once wanted to be. What James didn't know was that in just a few weeks, he would come face to face with Victoria Bennett again. And that meeting would change his approach to justice forever. James Morton had never particularly enjoyed legal conferences. Too much small talk, too many people trying to impress each other. But the annual judicial conference in London was mandatory, so here he was, wearing his best suit and trying to look interested in a discussion about recent changes to property law. During a coffee break, James wandered away from the crowded main hall. He found a quiet corridor with tall windows overlooking the Thames River. The afternoon sun streamed in, warming the wood-paneled walls. For a moment, he felt peaceful. "It's a beautiful view, isn't it?" came a voice from behind him. James turned and felt his heart skip a beat. Standing just a few feet away was Victoria Bennett, newly confirmed to the Supreme Court. She wore a simple red dress with a black blazer, looking every bit the important figure she was. "Justice Bennett," he managed to say, his mouth suddenly dry. Yes, it is quite lovely." "Judge Morton," she replied with a warm smile. "It's good to see you again." James blinked in surprise. "You remember me?" "Of course. We met in your courtroom about 3 months ago." She stepped forward to join him at the window. A speeding ticket in a school zone. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. James cleared his throat. Justice Bennett, I feel I must apologize for how I handled your case. She raised her hand gently. There's no need. You were doing your job. I was speeding in a school zone. The law applied to me just as it would to anyone else. But I didn't properly listen to your explanation about your mother, James said. I was too quick to dismiss it. I should have shown more compassion. Victoria turned to face him directly. How is a judge supposed to know which emergency is real and which is made up? You can't give special treatment based on a story with no proof. That wouldn't be fair to others. How is your mother now? James asked quietly. Victoria's expression softened. She's recovering well, thank you for asking. She's back home with part-time care. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching boats move along the river below. I watched your confirmation hearings, James admitted. You mentioned the speeding ticket. Victoria nodded. It was an important moment for me. Important? How could being fined be important? It reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place, she explained. To make sure that every person who enters a courtroom is truly seen and heard as a human being, not just a case number. That day in your court, I could have mentioned my position or the important meeting I was missing. But that would have been asking for special treatment, which goes against everything I believe about equal justice. James felt a deep respect growing for this remarkable woman. You're a better person than most would be in that situation. Victoria laughed softly. Not at all. I was quite angry at first. But then I realized it was a good reminder that the system works best when rules apply to everyone, regardless of their position. They were interrupted by the sound of the conference bell, signaling the next session was about to begin. I should get back, Victoria said. I'm on a panel in 5 minutes. As she turned to leave, James found his voice again. Justice Bennett, I've been thinking a lot about our brief encounter and what it means to truly listen in a courtroom. It's changed how I approach my work. She stopped and smiled at him. That's good to hear, Judge Morton. Perhaps some good came from my speeding ticket after all. More than you know, he replied honestly. Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. I'm starting a mentorship program for judges focused on compassionate judicial practice. We're looking for experienced judges to help lead workshops. She handed him the card. I think you might have valuable insights to share. James took the card with surprise. Me? But I was the one who followed the law while treating me with respect, she finished for him. And who is now reconsidering his approach. That's exactly the kind of growth the program needs to showcase. As Victoria walked away to her panel, James stood by the window a little longer, turning her business card over in his hands. The woman he had once fined without a second thought was now offering him an opportunity for professional growth and meaningful contribution. Life had a strange way of bringing people back together, he thought. And sometimes, those unexpected reunions held the greatest opportunities for change. 1 year had passed since James Morton's chance meeting with Justice Victoria Bennett at the London conference. Now, on a bright spring morning, he sat in his chambers reviewing a letter that had just arrived. The official Supreme Court letterhead caught the sunlight streaming through his window. Dear Judge Morton, the letter began. We are pleased to inform you that your work with the Judicial Compassion Program has shown remarkable results. The feedback from participants has been overwhelmingly positive. James smiled as he remembered his initial nervousness about accepting Victoria's invitation. He had worried that he wasn't qualified, that his presence in the program might seem hypocritical given how he had once treated her. But Victoria had insisted. Your journey is exactly what makes you perfect for this, she had told him during their first planning meeting. You understand the shift in perspective because you've experienced it yourself. The program had started small, just 12 judges meeting monthly to discuss how to balance strict application of the law with compassionate understanding of human circumstances. James had shared his story about finding Victoria and how that encounter had changed him. Other judges shared similar moments of realization from their careers. Soon, word spread. Judges from across the country asked to join. Now, 1 year later, over 100 judges participated in the program, and the early results showed improvements in public trust in the courts where these judges presided. James continued reading Victoria's letter. I would like to invite you to speak at our national conference next month. Your perspective as one of our founding mentors would be invaluable. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. Judge Morton? You have someone here to see you, his assistant said. A Mrs. Robinson about her son's case. Send her in, please, James replied. A tired-looking woman in her 50s entered his chambers. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hands rough from work. Mrs. Robinson, please sit down, James said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I understand your son missed his court date yesterday. Yes, Your Honor, she said nervously. Tommy had to take me to the hospital. My heart problems flared up, and he's the only one who could drive me. I know that sounds like an excuse. Do you have any documentation from the hospital? James asked, his tone gentle rather than suspicious. The woman nodded and handed over a crumpled hospital discharge paper. James examined it carefully. The timestamp matched the court appointment her son had missed. Thank you for bringing this in, James said. I'll reschedule your son's hearing without penalty. Relief washed over Mrs. Robinson's face. Thank you, Your Honor. Tommy was so worried. He said judges don't usually listen to explanations like this. Perhaps that was true once, James replied with a small smile. But things are changing. After Mrs. Robinson left, James returned to Victoria's letter. At the bottom was a handwritten note. James, I thought you might like to know that my mother has fully recovered and often talks about that nice judge who helped change her daughter's work for the better. Funny how life connects us, isn't it? Victoria. James reached for a pen to write his acceptance to speak at the conference. As he did, he thought about how much had changed in just 1 year. His courtroom was now known as a place where justice was served with both firmness and understanding. People left feeling heard, even when judgments went against them. Compliance with court orders had improved. Even his fellow judges had noticed the difference. You've gone soft, Morton, one of his more traditional colleagues had commented recently. Not soft, James had replied. Just more complete in my understanding of justice. As he finished his letter to Victoria, James remembered something his father, also a judge, had told him years ago. The law is written in black and white, son, but it's applied to lives that are full of color and complexity. For too many years, James had forgotten that wisdom. It took a chance encounter with Victoria Bennett, first as a judge and defendant, then as colleagues, to remind him of the true meaning of justice. Outside his window, James could see people entering the courthouse for today's cases. Each person carried their own story, their own circumstances. Today, as every day now, he would do his best to see them all clearly, not just as cases to be processed, but as human beings worthy of both justice and compassion. And that, he realized, was perhaps the most important verdict of his career.